Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the musical theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, where are we going today?
Today we talk about Disney's The Lion King. That's so fun that we're finally talking about something that happened during my lifetime. It's so much more fun.
I know, right? The Lion King, 1997.
1997. So this is the fifth of our show-specific episodes in this season, with what we're looking at, the Tonys on tour. So Lion King premieres in 1997, and it wins the Best Musical in 1998. So that's what we're talking about today. But first, trust but verify, the excited historian.
We told you this would come back.
I know, yeah.
We told you it would recur.
One of the things that and I know we've talked about this in earlier episodes, is just that this is when you're talking in front of a classroom and when you're doing a podcast like this that is very much meant to be a conversation and not meant to be a read paper, you're going to misspeak. I am not a computer. I'm going to say things that are wrong and I just keep going because my brain hasn't even figured out that I've made a mistake. So sometimes we have to go back and kind of fix. So apparently somewhere in the Annie episode, I or Kristin, I'm still not really sure, said that Annie was based in the 1940s. It's not. It's based in the 1930s, and everything else that we said kind of worked with that. But this is yet another example of, we are barreling through all of this information, and sometimes the words just don't come out right. So our apologies for that.
Yes, and actually, I want to add one of my own. I don't know that I stand corrected, but I do want to put this out there because I still think I hold my belief. Anyway, here's what happened. So when I'm talking about Martin Charnin picking up that book, The Hard Knock Life or The Hard Life of Annie Little, whatever it was called, the book that inspired Martin Charnin to write the musical, the collection of comic strips. I said it was published in let me go back there. I said that he picked it up in 1970. Christmas of 1970 specifically. Well, subsequently, I received Annie, a theater memoir, which I could not get here prior to recording the episode, but I did get here afterwards. I pushed this on our social media accounts. So if you follow along there at Dr. Bway on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, then you may have seen that video where I talk about this resource because it's outstanding. If not, go check it out. But when I read that, Charnin says he picked it up in 1971, Christmas of 1971. That may very well be the case. However, the research that I had done looking through mostly newspaper archives had all said it was 1970, and the book was published in 1970. So I'm inclined to think it's more likely that this book was proudly displayed in a bookstore for him to pick up and rifle through in 1970 as opposed to 1971. However, I don't know that. It's one or the other, right? My educated guess remains 1970, but he's the guy who did it. So he would know better or not. Sometimes
we all make those things. It's
that's exactly right.
Okay, he says it was 71. Great. He's looking back at kind of what he was doing and what he was. Yeah. You know what? 20 years after the fact, I don't know.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And by the way, we're more like 50 years after the fact.
Yeah, so
which is kind of mind blowing.
I'm just getting so old, and
but at any rate, I did. As soon as I saw that 1971, I thought I better correct myself. It's very often when you're researching for projects like this that creators, just like we do, my memories kind of all clumped together in everything happened to me in 1987 or 1995, and then all those other years just kind of blend together for me. And so I could very easily see him thinking, it was 1971, just meaning early 70s. But all the newspaper articles I had read prior to said 1970. I know the book was published in 1970. It doesn't matter, but I do want to correct myself because, we always want to acknowledge when we
discrepancy, when there's a difference of opinion there. But
that's right. It's never our intent to be wrong.
But this is history. History is such a mess.
It is a
We seem
mess.
to think that history is some sort of like collection of facts, and it has never been a collection of facts. It has been a collection of reminiscence, and like I don't know, like
Who gets to tell their story, right?
yeah,
Who lives,
yeah.
who dies, who tells your story,
Thank
as has
you.
been famously
I was
said.
like, wait a minute, what was I saying? And I was
Yes,
like, wait,
yeah,
does that cover that? Yeah. So
yeah,
I
it
mean,
does.
history's a mess, and it always will be. So you still have to, you know, I think part of it is that we're taught when we're young, like we need to memorize all of these facts. And
That's
I'm like,
right.
the facts
If you
don't
can match up
matter.
right, if you can match up these dates with these people, then you've got it down. And it is not that simplistic at all.
And the teaching of history has completely shifted. I know that I was taught that way, but when I
Yeah.
teach history, no, I'm never asking questions about dates.
Right.
I'm
No,
never
no, no,
asking
no.
questions about this, that, and the other
No.
thing. I'm asking about, can you put it into context in the culture that it's
Exactly.
living in? Because we have Google.
Right.
You know, like
Bingo.
we can
Yeah.
Google these things. These are not things
Yeah.
that need to be memorized anymore. So
Exactly. Exactly. And even what we choose to talk about in regards to these shows. I mean, we could go
oh yeah.
15,000 different directions in what we choose to focus on. We're trying to keep it to an hour and well, we're trying to keep it to 30 minutes, but it's become an hour and
Yeah,
15.
no.
No, it did not work.
It's not
But so
happening.
so now as we've given ourselves a little bit more time, not a little bit, more than double the amount of time we'd anticipated using, we still have to pick and choose what we're going to highlight, and that's the game of being a historian. And like I said, I believe in the Chicago episode, that's why it's so important that there are a variety of historians,
Hmm.
because we're all interested in different things and we all choose to hone in on different aspects of development of these shows, and that's what it takes to get really a complete picture.
Yeah, no one person is going to have the complete picture. It's never going to happen. So,
Never, never. So at any rate, we humbly acknowledge our shortcomings and thank you for the grace that you show us when we do. All right, so here's another potentially new segment that I want to introduce, and I think I'm going to call it "Just a Little More to the Story." Just a little bit. Just a little bit more. Sometimes we may give you just a little bit more because we get some feedback from a listener who says, you know what? I'd like to know just a little bit more. Now, if you know us, you know just a little bit of anything is real hard for us. We tend to give all or nothing. However, I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet. I had some listener feedback from my friend Becky Combs. Becky Combs is the proprietor of Broadway Stacks. So if you're familiar with that company that makes the friendship Broadway themed friendship bracelets, this is Becky. She likes to do her beading, and at times when she does, she'll listen to the Dr. Broadway podcast, which we certainly appreciate. And she was saying after listening to the Annie episode, she wanted to hear more about the Gower Champion 42nd Street, opening night thing, which we mentioned
and
because
we
Martin
both went, oh,
Sharnon.
no, no. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah,
Oh,
right,
that's for
right.
another time.
Exactly. So here we go. We'll give you just a little bit more. So we mentioned that on that episode because Martin Sharnon, remember, he was emphatic that he direct this new show. And when the fellow creators pushed back against that, he said, okay, I'll step aside if you can get Michael Kidd, Jerome Robbins, or Gower Champion. That's what inspired us to even bring this up.
Yeah.
Because when I think Gower Champion, God love him, he had an illustrious career that included directing Hello Dolly and starring in film musicals and all kinds of wonderful, amazing things. But what I think of is opening night of 42nd Street, which he directed
Yeah.
when he died. So here, this is for you, Becky, at Broadway Stacks. I'm going to give you just a little bit more to the story. So here's what happened. So, as I mentioned, producer David Merrick, who was famed impresario, certainly along the lines of Ziegfeld, Fleur and Ziegfeld, I mean, definitely caught in that mold. He is producing a show called 42nd Street. Now, 42nd Street was an adaptation of a 1933 film. So the next time people try to tell you that, oh, this film to stage thing is all brand new, tell them, no, you're crazy, because it happened in 1980 with 42nd Street, which was not written for Broadway. It was written for a 1933 film. So at any rate, they are adapting this for Broadway in August of to premiere in August of 1980. Now, Merrick and Champion had worked together before. They'd produced they created together Hello Dolly, which for a time was the longest running show in Broadway history. We've talked about Hello Dolly. It ran for 6 years, 2,800 plus performances. It won the Best Musical Tony Award in 1964. So they had a long running history of working together. And it was difficult to work with a man like David Merrick. And maybe you'll understand why here in just a moment. But at any rate, they decide they're going to do it again towards the end of the 1970s, and they start working on developing 42nd Street for Broadway. Now, the budget for this show was $2 million. At the time, that was the most expensive Broadway show to date. That would be the modern equivalent of $8 million, which won't get you close to Broadway nowadays. But back then, that was a tremendous amount of money. Now, during the production, during the preparation for this show, Champion was suffering from a very rare form of blood cancer. And the company knew that he was very sick, but he also had nevertheless been able to keep going with the show. What they did know, as time went by, he was there less and less. And together they kind of collectively told themselves, we're going to do this one for Gower, kind of win one for the Gipper sort of thing. We're going to do this for Gower. And so they go about their show, and eventually they don't really even notice that Gower is present less and less and less and less throughout the rehearsal process. Well, on what ended up being the show's opening day, August 25th of 1980, Gower Champion dies. He died about noon on August 25th. Merrick told no one in the cast. And in fact, he called them to a rehearsal so that they were at the theater all day and could not hear it from anybody else. He had guards at the doors to keep them from, sneaking out or keep anybody from sneaking in. He did not want them to hear. He also called his connections at the newspapers and said, I tell you what, if you'll keep this secret about Gower Champion dying, I'll let you record my curtain speech tonight, which was, at the time, a big deal. We didn't have influencers with cell phone cameras recording everything. And so that was a really big give that he offered them. So at this opening night performance, just before the curtain goes up, Merrick says, listen, please stay in your seats until the very end of all the curtain calls. He didn't want reviewers racing out too soon before he'd made his big announcement to file their reviews. So at the end of the show, people are going crazy. It's a big hit. Everybody, if you've seen 42nd Street, it is a crowd pleaser. So people are applauding, loving it. I've read there were between 12 and 18 curtain calls, again, depending on who you read and what you believe. Suffice it to say, people were loving it. So at the end of the final curtain call, Merrick walks out and he is somber. You can watch this on YouTube, by the way. He is I'm sure I'll put it on our social media at some point. He is very somber and he says, this is a tragic night. Now you can imagine the juxtaposition of the audience laughing, cheering, and they actually heard him say that and laughed at him like, what's he doing now?
Yeah.
They didn't know he was serious. He then informs the audience, and by the way, the cast who'd been locked in the theater rehearsing all day, that Champion had died that day. Everything you can how do you respond to that? Like the theater goes cold, right? Like nobody knew what to do. Finally, Jerry Orbach, who was the star of the show, tells the stage manager to lower the curtain so the curtain goes down, and that's it. But the next day, instead of there being reviews of 42nd Street just in the New York papers, the news of Gower Champion's death on opening night of his brand new show is in papers across the world.
The reason we kind of went during the Annie discussion was just because it's a publicity stunt at that point.
It's exploitative.
And there's been a lot of commentary on whether that was, whether we need to engage in that kind of publicity. There's also the story that Gower Champion was at least seeing someone in the cast, a very young person, and they didn't tell her, and so she found out on stage as well, and that was part of the reason that the whole cast. you've ever been in a cast, everybody knows everybody's business. And
Right,
so,
of course.
everybody was like, oh, Gower died, but then they were like, oh no,
Yes.
and it's,
Yes.
of course, Jerry Orbach was like, put the curtain comes down now. Like,
Yeah.
we don't need to litigate this in front of everybody. We don't need to cry in front of everybody after
Right.
this great success. But that juxtaposition did do a great thing for the publicity. It did a great thing for ticket sales. It did,
Yeah, of course.
And we kind of go, okay, impresario, you did what you needed to do for the commercial side of it. What about the human side?
Right. Yep.
And part of me does wonder. I'm like, it wasn't getting horrible reviews. Like,
Right.
it probably could have stood on its own feet. So why did we feel
You
like
would
we needed
think.
to do that? So
You would think. Yeah, it's interesting. And then, when you dig into it, you see that the opening was put off multiple times in August. And when you know the end of the story, it does make you question, was that intentional? Did he push that off because he was waiting until Champion died, knowing that he was at that point and the cast did not know? Who knows? We cannot know what was his intent. We can know that it has become, it's not apocryphal. This happened. I mean, this is verifiable. One of the great tales of theater history. And then interestingly, to make matters worse, perhaps, well, depending on where you fall on whether or not it was a good idea or a bad idea, the memorial service was held at the theater, followed by a special matinee performance.
oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, some people say they're like, that's a fitting end to somebody, that was so important to musical theater, like Gower Champion. But at the same time, it just kind of makes you gotta go, ooh, I have a little bit of cringe.
Yes, you gotta cringe.
A little bit of it.
You gotta cringe. Regardless, just so you know, Becky, the show ran for 8.5 years and nearly 3,500 performances. For a time, it was the longest running musical in Broadway history. Hello Dolly's record had already been broken, but nevertheless, it ran even longer than Hello Dolly had. So the Merrick Champion collaboration was a very, very good one. But now you know just a little bit more of the story. Just a little bit more. There you go. All right.
So now we're 17 minutes in.
Right.
So let's talk about The Lion King. This is why, y'all, like.
I know. But I did want to mention that because I do think it's really interesting. And I don't know that we'll get to 42nd Street anytime soon. It's not touring at the moment. It could at any time come back.
And it's very, very hard to produce.
Yes. You got to have a lot of great dancers.
And there are a lot of great dancers out there. But the thing is that as a producer, everybody goes, ooh, are we going to have enough people to actually do this? Like, it's becoming harder and harder to do.
Yeah, no question. All right. So on that note, let's pivot to the reason we're here today, which is to talk about The Lion King. All right. So we're going to start our conversation about The Lion King. It's a massive discussion. As you can imagine, there really are 1,000 different ways that we could take this one. So what I've tried to do is kind of narrow it down and just go straight linear. Here's how we get there. And we, of course, have to start with just Disney in general. We all are familiar with Disney. We all know what they've done. We know their film started with Snow White, which even still, when adjusted for inflation, is one of the highest grossing animated films of all time. So that's in 1938, I believe, the late 30s. And that's then followed by this just murderer's row of unbelievable successes like Pinocchio and Fantasia and Dumbo and Bambi and Cinderella and Alice in Wonderland and on and on and on and on. They just had created this niche of creating the most unbelievable animated films. Of course, that also worked in tandem with their theme parks, which started to pop up in the mid 1950s and then again in the early 1970s. And so things are hitting on all eight with Disney, right? Until they aren't. And we've alluded to in a previous episode kind of the dark age of Disney animation being the 70s and early 1980s. So they're making films still, but they are definitely nowhere near as successful as they had been. This is when we get Robin Hood, which I think is a great movie, by the way.
I love Robin Hood.
I love that movie.
But that's at the early part
That's
of the dark
1970, I
age.
think.
Yeah.
It's early in this timeline for
I mean,
sure.
we're not
It's maybe
talking
not seven,
about
but it's early 70s.
what's the Black Cauldron, or like we're not talking about the
Yes.
Black Cauldron yet.
No, 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 no. Then we get the Rescuers. Then we get the Fox and the Hound. I think the Fox and the Hound was 80, maybe a little before that.
Which I
Um,
watched as a small child, and I
remember
still
the
have,
devastation? Yeah,
yes,
it's heartbreaking. Same, same.
it's awful. So,
Yeah, same, same. So, they suddenly begin to realize that they ain't what they used to be and they want to get back to where they were. Okay. So they realize they need to make a change in the early to mid 1980s.
and
Now let's put a pin right.
there
Go
are
ahead.
great historians that do just Disney animation stuff. Like,
Yeah.
go seek that out if you're interested in this time. There's so much there, and there are lots of
Yes.
really great reasons for what happens and when. It's fascinating, but
Yeah.
that's for somebody else's podcast. Anyway.
That's exactly right. And we're going to talk in broad strokes. So
Yeah.
forgive us where there are things that could be filled in. We've had to be very selective with
Yes.
what we're able to talk about because, as you can imagine, when you're talking about Disney plus Broadway, there is just
Oh, gosh.
so much to say.
Yeah.
So much to say. So, at any rate, now I'm going to put a pin in talking about Disney and talk about two men named Peter Schneider and Thomas Schumacher. All right. So, in the early 1980s, just as Disney is realizing something has got to be done with our animation department, Peter Schneider and Thomas Schumacher are working together to build events, mostly artistic events celebrating the arts for the Los Angeles Olympics, right? This is the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Were you able to, I know you're from
Yes.
LA. Did you take
No.
part in that at all?
I did. Well, take part. I went.
Well,
I had
not
the hat.
participate.
I
Did
had
you?
I had a little hat for a long time. Somewhere along the line, I threw it away, which was stupid. Why?
I
did we
know.
I mean, I don't know. But yeah, I had pins, and we went to the Coliseum, and
That's awesome.
I think just once. I don't know how my parents did that in 1984, but
Yeah.
I remember that, and
Yeah.
it was, I mean, even being I think I was 6 or almost 6, and I remember just being like, wow, the entire city is overtaken by this, and LA is huge, y'all.
Right. Right.
So I mean, and we lived out still considerably in the suburbs, and we still felt like everybody was everywhere. It was a big
Yeah.
event.
Yeah. I remember, obviously, I was in South Carolina at the time, so I was very far away from LA, but I remember the McDonald's Happy Meal commercials because
Yes.
I remember wanting the LA Olympics themed Happy Meal toys. That's
Yeah.
what I remember.
And the mascot that was like this cross between I mean, it was a bald eagle, but kind of looked like Uncle Sam.
Yes.
Do you remember that guy?
Yes, of
It was
course
a
I
great
do.
mascot.
Of course I do. Of course I do. That's that's what these guys were doing. They were working to pull together the 1984 Olympics Arts Festival, which if you've been around Olympics, you know this happens. It's a celebration not only of athletics, but also of arts of all of these world creators. And so that's what they were doing. That led to the development of what was called the Los Angeles Festival, which was to be a biennial 4-week festival of performing arts in LA. And it was kind of an offshoot of the Olympic Arts Festival. And the reason I bring it up was because the man in charge was to be Thomas Schumacher, who was one of the guys that I had mentioned. Now, Peter Schneider, who was one of the other guys, or the other guy that I mentioned, he goes on to join Walt Disney Animation around 1985, 86. We're going to come back to him, so don't forget about Peter Schneider. But for now, we're going to focus on Thomas Schumacher, who stays in LA for a time to work on the Los Angeles Festival. Now, as he is looking for different acts to bring to LA to be a part of this festival, he's looking specifically for the 1985 festival. He comes across a show that is being developed or has been performed in Massachusetts called Liberty's Taken. Liberty's Taken was an irreverent look at the American Revolution done in puppetry and song, co-written and directed by, who do you think?
Julie Taymor?
It was. That's exactly who it was.
So I was like,
It was
I
Julie
have
Taymor.
never heard this story. This is going to be so fun. Okay.
You're exactly right, Julie Taymor. So Julie Taymor, who we'll talk more about in just a few minutes, but Julie Taymor was a Massachusetts native. She had started performing in theater at the Boston Children's Theater as a child, had gone on to attend Oberlin College in Ohio, and she had worked on Liberties Taken for 4 years. And in 1985, it was performed in Massachusetts. So Schumacher gets wind of this and thinks, hey, that could be really good for the Olympic Arts, or I'm sorry, for the Los Angeles Festival in 1987. So he reaches out to her and he's like, hey, what do you think about this? And she says, well, I'm interested. And so I'll send you, what I would need to make it work. Well, if you know Julie Taymor's shows, Julie Taymor's shows have a pretty big footprint, right?
Yes.
These are not done in a suitcase. So
these take over Broadway theaters for years before the things even, start. Exactly.
So Schumacher says, he gets her, her workbook and all the things that she's in. He's like, maybe not. Looks great, but maybe not. He just basically realizes he doesn't have the resources to bring this show and to do it justice for the Los Angeles Arts Festival. But he does tell her, this looks incredible. I hope we'll work together in the future. Right. And subsequently, her name keeps coming up as she moves on from Liberties Taken and starts doing more and more and more projects, like, directs an opera version of Oedipus Rex, things like that. People keep saying to him, hey, have you heard about this Julie Taymor this or Julie Taymor that? Her name keeps coming up. And, we've all experienced that where something just keeps, and you're like, am I supposed to do something with this? What is this, And that's exactly what happened with Schumacher and Julie Taymor's name. So now I'm going to go back to Schneider. Peter Schneider, who had worked with Thomas Schumacher in LA on the Olympics. Schneider goes to Disney in 1985, and he becomes the first president of Disney's feature animation department. Okay. 3 years later, after Thomas Schumacher has had this conversation with Julie Taymor in 1988, Thomas Schumacher joins his buddy Peter Schneider at Disney Animation. Now, it's not long after that, in 1989, that Disney Animation goes on what is widely referred to as the Disney Renaissance, right? This is when we get The Little Mermaid in 1989, which is the sixth highest grossing film of that year. It wins 2 Academy Awards. And Disney begins to say, okay, maybe we're hitting on all 8 again. Maybe this is refocusing on what had historically been a hallmark of our brand, which was great animated films. So The Little Mermaid led, with Walt Disney Animation led by Peter Schneider and Thomas Schumacher, things begin to cook again at Walt Disney Animation, right? So they have Little Mermaid in 1989. In 1990, they start working on a non-animated film, believe it or not. It was a National Geographic style show that they were going to do called King of the Jungle. Now, remember that, because it doesn't stay a non-animated National Geographic style thing for long. But remember, it starts in 1990. Then in 1991, Beauty and the Beast hits. And where The Little Mermaid had been the, 6th highest grossing film of 1989, Beauty and the Beast was the 3rd highest grossing film of 1991. And it was the first animated film to gross over $100 million in the US. So it was a big, big deal. It was also the first animated film to be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture. But what's most essential, the reason why I have to go back and talk about the Disney Renaissance in film in order to talk about The Lion King on Broadway, is because Frank Rich, famed New York Times theater critic, wrote a column in 1991, the Year in Arts theater column. He did this every year. And in it, he called Beauty and the Beast, this animated film, children's film for all intents and purposes, he called it, quote, the best Broadway musical score of 1991. Well, it didn't take long before executives at Disney said, wait, what?
Excuse me?
What, huh? Can we do that? Are we doing this? And sure enough, in no time, we have the formation of Walt Disney Theatrical Productions. You may have heard it called Disney on Broadway, Disney Theatrical Group. It's had a number of different name changes throughout the years, but it starts off after this column is written by Frank Rich as Walt Disney Theatrical Productions. And immediately they get to work on producing Beauty and the Beast for Broadway. Beauty and the Beast, of course, premieres on Broadway in April of 1994. It runs for 13 years. 5,500 performances thereabouts. It makes about $500,000 a week on Broadway.
Yeah.
Now, if you know anything about Disney, when they make a little bit of money at something, they say, hey, can we do more of that?
Can we make more of this money on Broadway? Could we have all of the theaters be ours?
Exactly. Can we make a little bit more? Do you think? So they immediately begin thinking, we're making $500,000 a week at Beauty and the Beast. What else can we do? Well, that film that I mentioned earlier, that National Geographic style film, King of the Jungle, in the intervening 4 years has become The Lion King, right? It premieres in June of 1994. It has music by Elton John and lyrics by Tim Rice. Tim Rice is certainly a name we've discussed on this podcast before. It becomes the highest grossing film of 1994. It makes more than $300 million in the US alone. And the morning after the film premiered, several of the film executives are sitting around with Disney executives and theatrical executives at Disney, and they're talking to Elton John, who wrote the music. And they said, what do you want to do next? And he goes, well, I don't really want to do another movie next. But didn't you just put Beauty and the Beast on stage? Maybe I'd like to do something like that.
Yeah.
And so they said, you know what? We're actually thinking of developing Aida for the stage. Maybe you'd like to be a part of that. So he said, yeah, absolutely, count me in. At the same time as they're trying to move Aida down the line, you've got the Walt Disney Theatrical Production guys calling the Walt Disney Animation guys saying, hey, what else have you got for me? Beauty and the Beast has done us all kinds of right. So what else do you have that we can adapt for Broadway? And so the Disney Animation guys gave him some ideas. They mentioned, old favorites like Cinderella and Snow White, those movies that I mentioned from the early days of Disney, and then a couple of new ideas. But what interested Michael Eisner, big dog at Disney at the time, the chief executive who'll come up again in a few moments, what interested him most was The Lion King. And so when he says, what do you think about doing The Lion King on stage? Thomas Schumacher, who again had been with the Los Angeles Arts Festival, the Olympic Arts Festival, and now is at Walt Disney Animation, said to Michael Eisner, that's the worst idea I've ever heard of. Yeah, absolutely not. It's impossible. How are you going to create the African Sahara Desert on a stage? It's the worst thing I've ever heard.
That's why Disney always works. It's because they take something and they say, this is impossible to do. Do the impossible. Yeah. And that's, because if somebody had handed Lion King to me, I remember when I heard about it, I was like, oh, this is going to be awful. You mean you're going to put them in like character costumes like they do at Disney? This is going to ruin their chances and things. And then it's like, oh.
That's not what they're doing.
That's not what they're doing. This is a challenge. Okay.
But to Schumacher's credit, he's thinking like you are. Like, what are you No, of course, that's ridiculous.
Like, we can't do that. That's not what you're thinking, is it? Oh, my goodness.
Come on. And so as time goes by, every time Eisner sees Schumacher, Eisner will say, how's that Lion King project coming? And Schumacher every time will say, stop, it's not happening. It's impossible.
I don't want to do that.
Right? That's a terrible idea. We've heard this, that's a terrible idea phrase a time or two before on this podcast, haven't we?
Just a few.
Yeah, just a few. But we hear it again here. Schumacher says, absolutely not. Well, finally, Eisner, who, like I said, is the chief executive. I mean, he's not Disney Animation or Disney Theatrical. He is Disney.
Yeah.
Capital D. He is the big dog. And he stops asking and starts telling. It is no longer, how is that project coming? It is, get started on that Lion King project, right? And so Schumacher again says, but it's impossible. And Eisner says, it's not impossible. You just need a great idea. This is 1995-ish when this happens. And Schumacher, I think I'm going back and forth with how I say it, so pardon me for that. But Schumacher has a great idea. Just as Eisner says, you need a great idea. And he remembers a phone call he had in 1985 with a director named Julie Taymor. And he remembers what she did with Liberties Taken. So he calls her completely out of the blue, says, hey, Julie, it's been a decade. How are you? And they catch up. And she says, I'm interested. I know the Disney aesthetic is very different from my own. I haven't seen the movie. So what can you tell me about it? So in response, Schumacher sends her a copy of the VHS tape,
The
he then
VHS tape.
Well, I'm assuming maybe it was maybe it was a DVD.
It was
I don't
not
know.
a DVD. We did not have that yet. Maybe it was a laser disc.
Maybe. Ooh, that was fancy. That was fancy. High cotton if he had a laser disc player, if she had one. So at any rate, so he sends over a copy of the film in some medium, which is unspecified. And he also sent over a soundtrack as well as like an auxiliary soundtrack called Rhythm of the Pride Lands, which was a CD written by Lebo M, who was a South African who'd escaped apartheid at 14 and come to the US and had been writing music. He was with Elton John. He had helped to write some of the music for The Lion King, but he'd also released Rhythm of the Pride Lands, which was kind of inspired by sort of music. He sends that over. And Tamor begins to watch the movie, listen to the songs, and think about whether or not this fits in with her aesthetic. And to describe her aesthetic, I'm going to let Tracey talk a little bit more about Julie Taymor and the types of work that she was known for.
Well, I mean, I think Taymor... what you have to understand about Taymor is that she's cutting her teeth and learning during the late 60s, early 70s. That's when she's learning. She has an internship with a very famous American avant-garde troupe named Bread and Puppet Theater. And if you know anything about Bread and Puppet Theater, they're all about huge, massive puppets. But they also believe that in like the idea of kind of sharing, that art is a sharing experience. And so they make bread and they pass out bread, to everybody. And it's supposed to be this big communal thing. But she interns with them when she's young. And that makes a powerful, it's a powerful influence in kind of how she directs later on. I mean, they always kept saying about Julie Taymor when The Lion King comes out, it's just like, oh, she's the puppet lady. And I'm like, well, she's so much more than that. She doesn't just do puppets, but puppets are a huge part of it because a good puppet can anthropomorphize, some sort of animal or something in a way where a human can interact with them, where you don't actually need that animal anymore.
Right.
And she figured that out, I think, very, very early on. And a lot of it does kind of, I mean, you can see the influence of Bread and Puppet in her work. Because she's working with Bread and Puppet, she's also being exposed to the American avant-garde. And I'm not going to go into that because it would take way too long. But
we do have our boundaries.
We do have our boundaries there. So she has this internship with a puppet group that is part of the American avant-garde. One of the things about the American avant-garde that is important to this discussion, because there's lots of different avant-garde troupes, it's this idea that first and foremost, there's nothing that is that all theater is political and activist in nature. It is all about that mirror that we hold back to the audience. All American avant-garde, they don't have to be protesting something specific, but they're always talking about what's going on in society and what can we do to be better as a society. All of them are doing that. And the second major thing is that theatrically, what the American avant-garde does is change the spectator. Whereas the spectator, up until this point, most of the time we sit in our seats, don't we? And we observe through that fourth wall. That goes out the window with the American avant-garde, whereas the spectator is part of the action. They are often indicted for what is happening there. It becomes kind of what we call an immersive experience. So even if you are sitting in a theater and sitting in the seats, you are part of the whole. Now, some of this we start seeing in a musical as early as Cabaret, where in Cabaret, we're all sitting in the seats as we're in the cabaret and we are being very much indicted for staying in our seats and just allowing the kind of Nazi ideology to just go over us and politely clapping as we go through. It's that kind of idea. But that change in the spectator, I think, is really, really important because if you've seen anything that Julie Taymor has done, making you part of the world and making the whole theater part of the world is a huge hallmark of what she does. Even on tour, The Lion King, you know, even if when they can't outfit the theater because they own it all the way around and make it more of an immersive environment, even when they're on tour for a week or whatever, they're still putting all of the characters in the audience. There's a lot of kind of audience interaction and making the audience part of the conflict or part of the roadblock. Like the characters can't get over the audience or this way, so they have to go one way or the other. It's making sure that they are, it's kind of like you're on a ride at Disney. If you go on any of those immersive rides at Disney, if you go on Indiana Jones or they say that, I've not been on them, but the new ones, the Star Wars ones, it's like you're just in the middle of the action. You're not actually doing anything, but you are right there, right?
Yeah.
That is a hallmark of what she does, and that comes directly out of the American avant-garde. So we have that. What I find very interesting about The Lion King is that as she starts kind of working on the show, she's taking characters that have been created, music that's been created for a film. It's very Disney-esque, Fantasyland kind of characters on that level, and trying to bring them into a more immersive experience so that everybody enjoys them. So she takes the Disney and then she's starting to meld that, seam together these kind of disparate influences. We've got the Disney one, we've got a global cultural framework, and we've already talked about Le Bohème, who did that. It's not
Rhythm of the Pride Lands.
Rhythm of the Pride Lands. Yep. And I remember we had that. We listened to it in the car, you know.
Yeah.
And it was so different, but it was so like reminiscent of what was going on, and trying to take that global cultural framework and really make it the foundation upon which the story rests. Because if you look at the difference between the film and the show, there's very few comparisons other than the names of the characters and the storyline, right? I mean, they're so different because it is now seamed into this new kind of global cultural framework. So we have that. So there's two things. Then you have her influence from the American avant-garde, that change in the spectator, the change in immersion, and the puppetry, which she's getting from bread and puppet theater. And then you bring in American musical theater, where you've got Elton John and his collaborators who are going back and looking at the score and saying, okay, this also has to work in a kind of neoclassic golden age formula. And it does. It works that
perfectly.
way.
Yeah.
But that's what I think is so brilliant about what Julie Taymor does with The Lion King, is that she's drawing on so many disparate influences, and she says, okay, how do I make this all one? And she's not looking at one specific thing that she likes and says, I'm just going to do that. I'm just going to lean on the Disney side. I'm just going to lean on the musical theater side. I'm just going to lean on the avant-garde. No, it's all of this. It's interesting. Even today, I was talking to a former student last week, and he said, I had never seen The Lion King. I don't know how I missed it. He's a big musical theater guy, but somehow he missed it. He goes, somebody had an extra ticket, so I went. He goes, I'm looking at this, and all that stuff that you were talking about in the American avant-garde just kept hitting me. And it was like, that is straight out of Brecht. That is, and he's like finding all of these moments. And it's true. They are all there. But I think what's so beautiful about it is that she takes all of this kind of expertise and finds the right people to seam them together. So those are the four things that I think you're looking for when you look at this kind of adaptation.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for those insights. The bread and puppet conversation is a really interesting one. There's so much that we could go into. As with all of these creators, there's so much that we could say about Julie Taymor and the other things that she had done before and has done since. And
Yeah.
There's there's a Julie Taymor episode at some point
I mean, we
coming.
also are going to have to talk about Spider-Man someday.
I was
It will
yes,
never be
thinking of
on
Spider-Man.
tour because, but
Also, I know we ask each other the question, has that been settled? It has been settled. I did look it up
you
before
looked
we
it up?
recorded this. It has been settled. Yes.
Oh, there
Settled.
was a big lawsuit, y'all. We
Yeah.
were very worried
Maybe
about
we'll
what
give
was
you a little bit
happening.
more of the story next
Yeah,
time. We'll
maybe.
see. At any rate, so yeah, so Taymor rather comes in, and as Tracey has so eloquently described her style, you can hear from her influences and from the way that she works that this is not a traditional Disney thing.
Mm-mm.
So truly, when Eisner said to Schumacher, nothing's impossible, you just need a great idea. The fact that Schumacher thinks of Julie Taymor and remembers how she was able to handle such an epic story and the telling of it in Liberty's Taken and knew that she could handle The Lion King is really incredible. But also Taymor is not going to deny herself, right? She had to be sure that
Mm-hmm.
she could be true to her own artistic vision while working with what is probably the most conventional of artistic visions in terms of Disney, right? She
Mm-hmm.
had to be sure that it was a right fit for her. It wasn't just, oh, I'm going to do it, no questions asked. She really wanted to be sure, okay, these are some of the things that are stipulations for me. And if these don't work, then it's not going to work for me to take this project on. And so she starts to work on how she might present the story. And one of the first things that she says is, who wants to see a bunch of furry yellow lions up there? How boring would that be?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you were
Like what I was
imagining.
saying. I was like, oh,
Yeah, if it was just a bunch of mascots lined up on stage, no, thank you. There's nothing artistic about that. There's nothing interesting for her in that. So it would
mm-hmm.
not be the project for her if that's the way that they were going to take it. So they give her several months that she gets the phone call in 1995. A meeting is scheduled for January of 1996, where she's going to present her ideas to Eisner and some of the other executives at Disney. They're going to meet in Orlando in January of 96, which is kind of astounding to think, in terms of the timeline we typically expect for musicals today.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that she did this in a matter of months and not a matter of years is astounding. In fact, from that phone call in 1995 to its Broadway premiere in 1997 was 2 years.
Well,
That's
it's not a lot of time.
mind-blowing.
Yeah. I mean, what's nice about it is like the story didn't they knew the storyline worked. And the
Right.
story and the narrative doesn't change from the movie to the
Right.
we add a little
Right.
bit here and a little bit there, but
That's right.
we didn't have to worry about that part. What we had to
Right.
worry about was the visual part.
Yep.
And that is something you can throw money at, and it's not something that you need revision for.
Right.
So it's like,
right.
they got in all those craftsmen so quick. So 2
Yep.
years seems like no time at all, but it's something that could actually be done.
A lot of the work had already been done.
Because it was
Yeah, that's a
already
great point.
in,
Yep. Yep,
because the
that's a
book
great
was
point.
there.
Great point. So let me tell you some of the ideas after Taymor had watched the film and listened to the music. These are some of the ideas that she presented at that January 1996 meeting with Eisner and other Disney executives. One, as you mentioned, the story stays the same, but it was a 75-minute movie, and she's got to make a 2.5-hour show out of it. So they did have to expand some of Simba's story in particular. In fact, she calls it Simba's lost years, right? As she begins to dig in, what does Simba go through while he's out on his own? Whom does he encounter? How can we stretch that to tell us more of that character's arc? So she had to flesh out the story. She also had to flesh out the score. The film only had 5 songs, right? Elton John and Tim Rice had written 5 songs: Circle of Life, Just Can't Wait to Be King, Be Prepared, Hakuna Matata, Can You Feel the Love Tonight? These are the 5 songs, with lyrics anyway. There, of course, was underscoring, but these are the 5 singing songs in the show. She needed more of that. She's got to fill 2.5 hours. She needs more story. She needs more songs. She also wants more women. And so that's why she chooses to cast in the role of Rafiki, a woman. C.D. DeLuca originated the role on Broadway, but she chooses to make that a female character, that kind of the all-knowing, how would you describe Rafiki? The sage,
She's the God's power on earth. That's who she is.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
she's
yeah.
that shaman. I mean, she essentially is what.
It's perfect. That's a perfect word for it. But so she sees Rafiki as a woman in order to amplify the roles of women in this story. And she also beefs up Nala's role. We learn
Yeah.
more about Nala, particularly in the Simba Lost years. We get to see
Mm-hmm.
more of Nala. We get to understand who she is and the spunk and light that she has herself. So she comes up with, more story, more songs, more women. She then has to devise her own visual concept. And what she goes with, not surprisingly, is a circle of life motif. Like she
Mm-hmm.
sees that as the recurring theme. That's why she envisioned turntables within turntables, almost like a wedding cake. So when you see, the Lion
The
King, yeah, you see that
that
tower
is
that
what
they
it is.
walk up and they hold up baby Simba, and that is
Pride
the
Rock.
circle of life. There, yeah, that's right, and
And a lot
that
of
is
that is coming
turntables within turntables.
yet again from that global cultural framework and something that
Right,
she's very good
exactly.
on. Like she's pulling from like Chinese shadow puppetry,
Right.
right?
Oh
So she's
yeah, there's
pulling out
shadow
of there
puppetry in the film show. Yeah,
within, yeah, that within, but even the idea of the circles within the circles, like all of
yep,
that stuff is coming straight out of non-Western theater. And
right.
that's another reason why we love The Lion King, is because we've never seen that
Never.
kind of visual spectacle before.
Never, never. So she comes up with more stories. She comes up with more songs. She comes up with more women. She comes up with her visual concept. And then the final thing that she proposed in that meeting was, what if we do, introduce some new characters and maybe take the story rather, in a new direction. And
Hmm.
this is where Eisner put his foot down, to your point, and said, no, we know the story. We can flesh out what's already there. We can tell a little more about Simba and his fun with Timon and Pumbaa, but
We
we're
can
not going to
pull Nala
introduce new
in.
characters. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We can do more Nala. That's right. But we're not going to introduce new characters. But
So what
outside of saying no new characters, no new storylines,
hmm
Eisner greenlit everything. He said,
yeah.
let's see what you come up with. So she gets rolling. She's given a $15 million budget, which we talked about 42nd Street being the most expensive production to date at $2 million in 1980. Well, here we are at 1990. This is 96. She's given 15 million, which is the modern equivalent of about $30 million.
Which they
Uh,
already knew they would make back. Like
oh, of
the thing is
course.
that it's like you're looking at what Beauty and the Beast did.
That's right.
This is going to make it back, even if it's not good. Even if you're
That's
taking a
right.
risk, we're still going to get that. But
And that's why it's so important, Tracey, in telling this story, that you start at Beauty and the Beast, right? You
hmm
have to understand, you can't just say, oh, Lion King came to Broadway. You have to say, no, 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 no. Lion King was built on the bag of Beauty and the Beast,
because Beauty
right?
and the Beast doesn't really change from the movie. It is very movie
Very
esque,
similar. Yes, it
and this
absolutely
is
is.
not. And they are trying to say, hey, how important is Disney theatrical going to be here? Because remember, they do that little, you talked about it before, that little stopover in Aida, which was an okay show, but it's
Right.
just so weird that it's part of
Yeah.
Disney theatrical. It's like,
It,
what were
it
you
doesn't
doing?
fit the rest of the, yeah.
Disney theatrical had to kind of find their own niche and go, okay, we need to be doing kind of more stuff like The Lion King,
Yeah.
not doing new shows that have nothing to do with the parks, etc., and so on.
That's right. And I'm glad you mentioned Aida, because I would have forgotten to come back to it. But yes, while Elton John had agreed the day after the opening of the Lion King film to work on Aida, as work picks up on the Lion King, which is where Eisner really wants to go, Aida's kind of forgotten. Of course, it does happen. We do have Aida premieres actually in Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta at the time, premiered at the Alliance Theater, then goes to Broadway.
Yeah.
But is essentially a forgotten piece of Disney theatrical history, because it was eclipsed by their bread and butter, which was
Mhm.
bringing their very famous animated films to Broadway. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that back
Which
up,
is,
because
I
I
mean,
would have
it's
dropped
such a
that.
smart move because we talk about the commercialization all the time.
Right.
When you go to Broadway, and if you don't know anything about musical theater and you're standing in the middle of Broadway and somebody says, you're in New York, you should see a show, you're going to
Yeah,
go see a Disney show
most
because it's
likely.
something you've heard of. You're
That's
not going to go
right.
see something that you've never heard of.
Right. Right.
So they know they have cornered the market, and at this point, they've bought their own theater. They have made they've like worked with the city of New York to kind of buy up the entire few blocks so that they can control the facade of the exterior, what goes in there. So they've made basically a New York Disney for this one block there. And if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. Like, it looks like I'm walking down
Main Street, USA.
Either that or kind of like I'm in a Disney Springs or downtown Disney. Like, that's where you feel that they are. They've done this because they know people will feel comfortable and they will buy the ticket.
Right.
You know?
And there's a lot that could be said about what's called the Disneyfication of Broadway, and that's really vilified. Like, so a lot of people were very much against it. But what Disney did when they came in and they bought the New Amsterdam, which had been Florin Ziegfeld's, the Follies had been there in years gone by. It was built in 1903 and had fallen into disastrous disrepair. It's unbelievable, the disrepair it had fallen into. Disney sees they're going to be staying on Broadway, so they decide to buy their own theater. But they also know that their people aren't going to go to Times Square looking like Times Square looked in the early 90s, right? And my first trip to New York was 1991. I was in 8th grade. I remember we took a train into Penn Station from Boston, I think. I think we'd flown into Boston, train to Penn Station. I remember taking a cab through the theater district as soon as we got there from Penn Station, going right uptown and being terrified as a 13, 14-year-old, thinking, I cannot believe my father brought me here because it was so scary. And so Disney knew.
Yeah, in the 1970s, we had
Triple X shops next door. Yes, and that was still 1991.
And the 80s were still, I mean, it was a scary. I think we went in 88. We did a big trip back from LA, and I had the same feeling. We were all just like, where are we? And my parents keeping us very close and watching some girl have her purse stolen and just being like, I don't know where I am.
I want to go home. I want to go home.
But now you go and it feels like the safest place in the world. Even
Absolutely,
though I'm sure it's not. But it's like,
right, of course.
I walk around. I go on the subway. We didn't do any subway trips at all in 1988. So,
and a huge part of that atmosphere is owed to the fact that Disney knew our patrons are not going to bring their children to a place that they're afraid to bring their children. So we're going to play a part in cleaning that up. So for good, for better, for worse, whatever your opinion on that may be, it did attract millions of people and dollars to Times Square, right? Who would not have otherwise come. So Disneyfication is, Disneyfication is a whole other conversation that we can have, but that happens here. You're exactly right. They see we're going to stay on Broadway. We're going to buy our own theater. They buy the New Amsterdam, which had been Ziegfeld's theater, built in 1903. They completely gut it, renovate it to great expense. Although, yes. I
think it's in Maslin's documentary where Michael Eisner says, "I'm standing there in the middle with a hard hat on, and I look up, and there's this huge hole, and a bird poops on me." And I'm just
Yep, exactly. It's just heartbreaking to think that theater could get to that state. Although we know that it happened to lots of theaters, not just in New York, but across the country, where people have had to go in and save these historic theaters. So at any rate, Disney saves the New Amsterdam in the early 1990s, probably 90. Well, it opened in 97 with King David, which was a 9-day limited run, but it had been being reworked for several years prior to that. So at any rate, in January 96, Tamor is greenlit, says, go do this thing. Here's $15 million, most expensive show to date. Who cares? As Tracey pointed out, we'll make it back in spades. And they certainly have.
But what a different kind of director. She's creating all the masks. And she's not only, she's got tons of artisans, but she is doing the final work on these things. Because she is so detail oriented. So that there were lots of people in the background that were helping kind of get the whole thing moving. Because
that's exactly right.
She is a vision person. She is a production design person. I don't think that she really goes and gives notes to the actors.
Right. I don't know about that.
That's just, she's a production design kind of director, and that makes her perfect for this.
Absolutely. And it took that, again, we go back to Eisner saying you just need a great idea.
Yeah.
And Schumacher's great idea was Tamor.
Yeah.
Exactly. So after they get the green light in January 1996, they all go to work in a big loft on 27th Street. And to your point about them working with a bunch of art, about her working with a lot of artisans, this is a space that is big enough for everybody to work in together. So they're creating these puppets and the costumes all together in one big space. There are a number of designers. I am not trying to overlook them, but
so many.
There were so many that I don't want to name one, like Michael Curry, and then leave out all the others, because you're right. Julie Taymor ultimately was responsible for the unifying visual impact of the show. But just know that she worked with a number of unbelievably gifted designers and artisans in a loft on 27th Street where they all worked collaboratively. Then in August,
person.
That's
yeah, really
absolutely.
And that, I mean, nobody else could have come up with that.
Yeah, no.
But you need, like, if you're the idea person, to know that you're like, okay, now I need people to help me implement it.
Yes.
And then
you got to find the people and have the humility to say they can do this better than I can, or I'm going to trust them to do this. And, you know, I mean, it takes a really special leader to be able to pull that all together. So they have a workshop in August of 1996. Again, I'm struck by how quickly this comes together, given how long the timetable for a Broadway musical is now. Though your point is a really good one. They had most of the songs, they had the story done, but still it seems so fast.
Michael Eisner, but I mean, immediately, Lebo, okay, we already have another CD here that's already been made.
That's right.
How do we flesh this out? And a lot of stuff, just, there are all these moments, like, I'm always struck by the dance of or I think it's called The Hunt, where you've just got the lionesses, and they're just doing a dance.
Yeah.
You know, to try to, like...
And they're like wearing those tent costumes where they like... they're like a bed sheet.
That's awesome.
I know.
Anyway,
it's amazing. It is amazing. So at any rate, in that August 1996 workshop, you know, they first see kind of her ideas in 3 dimensions, right? They see, you know, prototypes of what she's going to do. And there was some concern that the puppets being visible at the same time as the actors are visible, you know, the audience is very aware of the mechanics of this puppetry.
Yeah.
There was some concern that would be confusing, but Taymor, that's where she drew the line. And she said, this is the way I do it. This is the part, for me, the artifice of theater, which again is very avant-garde and Brechtian,
very, you know,
in its tone.
The change in the spectator. We need to see how this works.
Yes, absolutely. You're so right. She said, no, they can handle it. First of all, I respect the spectator that they're sophisticated enough to be able to handle this. And she really said, this is the way it's going to be. This is the way we're going to do the show. And she got what she wanted. They said, okay, go with it. And so she did. There was a second workshop in early 1997. And then as the New Amsterdam is done, she does some rehearsals before their Minneapolis tryout, which happened in the summer of 97. They do some rehearsals at the New Amsterdam. So the New Amsterdam is finally ready. Like I said, it opened with Alan Menken and Tim Rice's oratorio King David in May of 1997. It just ran for 9.
They're like, does it work?
That's right.
Work?
Exactly.
That's exactly what that was.
That's exactly right. She wanted to see
quickly.
Exactly. She wanted to see if the scale of what she had created would work in that space. It did. So mission accomplished. So after several weeks of rehearsing in the New Amsterdam, they then moved to Minneapolis, where they have their premiere. They played July and August of 1997 at the historic Orpheum Theater in Minneapolis.
How many seats is that one? Do you know?
I don't know that.
The only reason I ask is because the New Amsterdam is about 1,200 seats, I believe. I looked that up this morning, and it's stacked on top of each other. If you've ever been in that theater,
tight fit.
It is a tight fit. So
yes.
If she's looking at scope for the New Amsterdam, I'm sure I would have been super overwhelmed by The Lion King in that space. But I saw it in the Pantages Theater in Los Angeles, which is much bigger. It's one of those road touring houses, so we're talking about like 3,000 to 4,000 seats, and it was just as big there.
Yeah.
So
like, no question.
You know, the fact that she's like, I don't know how this is going to play here, but we've got to figure out, will it play and feel as big in all of these different spaces? It's something to think about. Right. It's amazing.
Yeah. She had to test it. Now, fortunately, I think the fact that they had worked in that giant loft gave them a bigger scale, right? As they were creating the
Yeah.
show, that helped so much that they were able to create in a big space as opposed to a small one. So they
Yeah.
knew they had lots of room to fill. I think that was, a really wise
Hmm.
choice as they were developing the show. So the show is successful, not surprisingly, in Minneapolis, and then moves to the New Amsterdam. And it opens in November of 1997. Of course, it subsequently moved to the Minskoff. Once they realized this show's going to run forever and we need to put other shows here,
We
they
have
moved the
another
Lion
show
King to the
coming. Yeah.
right. They moved the Lion King to the Minskoff in 2006. I think Mary Poppins was the first show in after, and then
Yeah.
Aladdin, maybe.
And
Am I
then
missing
Aladdin.
one?
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so because I mean, Aladdin's in there now.
Yeah, Aladdin's been there 10 years,
Yeah, just kind of crazy.
which flew by.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at any rate, it opens at the New Amsterdam. Of course, it's nominated for all the Tonys, 11 of them to be specific. It certainly wins Best Musical, Best Scenic Design for Richard Hudson, Costume Design for Julie Taymor, Lighting Design for Donald Holder, Choreography for Garth Fagan, and Direction for Julie Taymor. And here, can I give you a little fun fact?
Hmm.
I was at the Tonys that year. For whatever reason, I was full of moxie when I was 21 years old. And I told my parents that for my 21st birthday, I wanted to go to the Tony Awards. I'm not sure that I would have been as receptive to that request had my children made it of me, but God love my parents. They were like, "Oh, that seems reasonable.
What a
Let's
reasonable
go."
request for your 21st birthday.
So we went to the Tony Awards. I feel like it might have been, and I may have false memories here, but I feel like it might have been like the first year they made tickets available to the public. And maybe that was what was the impetus for me being like, let's go to the Tony Awards. Whatever reason, my parents spoiled me and took me to see the Tony Awards. And I
Yeah.
remember
Shout out to the Stultzes right there.
shout out Tom and Pat. Shout out, y'all. They deserve all the shouts out. So I remember when Julie Taymor won. Again, I'm 21 years old and I'm watching this. I'm a junior in college, I guess, studying theater at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. And I remember when Julie Taymor won, and everybody, or I'm sorry, not when she won, but when they do the processional through the audience to the stage, right? To do the opening number for their Tony performance. And I remember as they finished that performance, the audience just explodes onto their feet. And Julie Taymor is there and clapping and so beaming with pride, as she rightfully should have been. But I remember thinking as a 21-year-old, I want to be like Julie Taymor one day. Not that I wanted to be a director, but that I wanted to have that moment where my great artistic vision had all come together. I mean, just what an incredible moment for a brilliant director. And
everything just did come together. And I
yeah,
mean, if you look
yeah,
at her subsequent career, having all those Disney artists supporting that vision,
yeah,
she really needed that to all kind of it was lightning in a bottle.
yes,
It was
no question.
that moment where you're like,
No
obviously
question.
I know what I'm doing, but it doesn't always come out clean. It
That's
like
right.
has to have all the right people involved.
That's right. So this is now Broadway's third longest running show after Chicago, which is the second.
It will be the
And
longest running show.
you think it'll go longer
It'll
than
keep-
Phantom? You think it'll beat Phantom?
I mean, it is a zeitgeist moment, like
Yeah,
in
no
musical
question.
theater, especially because I think what it does is it reignites. We're about to, if you've listened to the timeline episodes, like we're about to go back into that neoclassic era, but where we look at design and dance and music and book, all of those things working together. But this really ups our game when it comes to design. It is
no question.
I mean, it very much is that moment where Broadway needs to pay attention. We need to up our game, and they're having to. And so now we talk a whole lot more about design than we ever did before.
Yeah, great point.
Before The Lion King. And so it is, even if you're not doing a musical that's based on a film or based on a small lion or whatever, I mean, it is, when I said that, I remember I was doing like the first question and answer with the faculty for a master's program that I was trying to get into. And I remember saying to them, I was like, who's going to go see a show about a lion cub that kills his dad?
Mm-hmm.
Like if what I said is I was like, it's about a little lion cub and he wants to be cool and wants to be king and he ends up like killing his dad.
Yeah.
No one is coming to see that show with me.
Right.
Not one person. But if I tell them it's The Lion King, everybody is coming. And it's because, you know, all of these, again, she's able to seam together all these disparate influences. There's something for everybody. But it's also just, it is a classic work of art that I don't think we've ever come close to. As far
I agree
as
with
the
that completely.
visual and the immersive, even the, you know, I've seen lots of immersive productions, but this is the most, you know, it gets it. It's right there.
Yeah,
It's that
I agree
moment.
completely. And, you know, I remember at the time thinking, oh gosh, everybody's going to be doing puppets now. But it really, I mean, we had Avenue Q, obviously, but we really have not had an explosion of puppetry. But I think it's because it's not just every director who has that capability, right? I think
No.
we cannot underappreciate, or rather, we can't overappreciate what Tamor did. And you're absolutely right. It is a benchmark. It is landmark in every single way. What she was able to do and how it has not been replicated.
It hasn't. I mean,
No.
she goes on to do the Magic Flute for the National Opera, or for, no, not in the National Opera. I think it's for the Met in New York. And it has a lot of puppets in it. It feels very Lion King-esque, but that's, you know, and then you look at Spider-Man.
Yeah.
You know, Spider-Man, yeah, they're puppetry-esque stuff, but it's so much more technical.
Yeah.
You know, so she's even getting away from that. And
yeah.
it's, yeah, I don't think that, how could you? You're like, I'm going to use a puppet. If I use a puppet on stage at any time, they compare it to
The Lion King.
The Lion King.
Yeah.
Like, so you
of
don't
course.
even want to try. Like, I
Right.
did
That's a great point. Yeah.
the last show that I did, probably the last show that I'll ever do, because I have children now. But the last show I directed, we did The Secret Garden. And you have to have this little, there's supposed to be a robin in the tree singing to her. And we were like, somebody like had a puppet. And I was like, no puppets. Absolutely no puppets. Just like put the thing up there and twitch it a little bit. The audience can't see it anyway. But if you use a puppet, everybody's going to be like, not as good as.
Swing and a miss. Swing and a miss. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Well, okay. So just to wrap this one up, so we're at about 11,000 performances so far. Tracey thinks it's going to run forever and beat the Phantom of the Opera, which is #1 at the moment.
Yeah.
Last week's episode, Chicago is #2, and The Lion King is #3. So it's definitely in rare air. But I do want to kind of connect things back. You know, we started out connecting back to our Annie episode by talking about David Merrick and Gower Champion. I want to connect back to that episode again in closing for this one. You know, if you remember the Hal Prince quote that he told Charles Strauss after they had produced It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman, he said, if you do a show that kids can bring their parents to, you may be okay. But if you make a show that parents can bring their kids to, you've got a hit. And we talked at length about that. I remember that. So Tamor said something very similar. And so I wanted to share that just to kind of show how, you know, great ideas are great ideas, no matter where they come from. And she said, I knew this was a family show, but I would never play down to kids in my conceptualizing. I knew I would always go for elegance and sophistication, but that doesn't mean sophistication that kids don't like. There is no reason to patronize kids. They're hip. They get it.
Mm-hmm.
And she's really just saying what Prince said in a different way.
And not one child in that room was like, oh, it doesn't look like Mickey Mouse. I mean, I saw it in the first week of performances in Los Angeles. And the moment those elephants came down that aisle, the kids in the audience and the adults were all like screaming. They were so excited. And they don't need to be enclosed. It doesn't need to look like a real elephant. It is so amazing that it's like, that's a human in there. And they look like, this is awesome. You know?
Yes. Agreed.
She doesn't placate them. She's like, you are smart enough. You will see how this all works. You know that they're not animals, but that the story is universal. And the kids, I've not seen one kid be like, I don't understand what's happening.
I'm confused.
Not
Where's Simba?
one. They are right there.
Well, and to your point, I took my boys to see it last summer. They were 10 and 11 at the time. And I made sure to get aisle seats because I wanted them to see the procession as close as they could. And so we're right on the aisle. And my 10-year-old looks back at me and says, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And, it was one of my favorite, of all the many shows I have seen, it was one of my favorite moments in my own theater going career.
25 years later?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Still, this is so cool.
It
25 years
cool.
later, I don't think this is going to run forever, and then no one's going to be able to touch it. That's my prediction.
You may be right. You may be right.
That's what we've told. I've told Caroline this. I was like, the girls need to see their first Broadway show needs to be The Lion King. Because that is quintessential what brings the magic.
No question.
Of what we do. So
no question. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in next time when we'll be talking about 2011's Irreverent, The Book of Mormon by Matt Stone, Trey Parker, and Robert Lopez, who has a Disney affiliation himself. Mm-hmm. Until then, connect with us via email at hello@drbroadway or on Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast. See you next time.